It began with a sealed envelope carried through a private Kensington Palace corridor just after dusk, an envelope stamped with the late Queen's personal crest and guarded more carefully than most state documents. But the moment Catherine opened the letter, everything inside the room changed. The Princess of Wales reportedly froze mid-sentence, her hands trembling as she read words never meant for public eyes. And within hours, palace staff realized something deeply emotional had just shattered the calm behind royal walls. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Reports suggest the confidential document had remained hidden for years inside a secured royal archive connected to Queen Elizabeth II's final private correspondence, far away from the public ceremonies and carefully rehearsed smiles that usually define palace life. According to insiders whispering within royal administrative circles, the letter resurfaced only after a highly restricted consultation involving senior aides, constitutional advisors, and Prince William himself, who allegedly knew fragments of its existence but never expected its contents to carry such emotional force. What began as a routine archival review reportedly transformed into something much heavier the moment the Queen's handwriting appeared across those aged pages, because this was not described as a ceremonial note or a sentimental farewell. Palace insiders claim it read more like a final warning from a monarch who understood that the institution she protected for 70 years was approaching one of the most fragile transitions in modern royal history. And at the center of that warning, according to various interpretations of the meeting, stood Catherine. Sources familiar with the private gathering claim the Princess of Wales became visibly emotional while reading a passage connected to sacrifice, duty, and the future burden that would eventually fall upon Princess Charlotte. One palace figure reportedly described the atmosphere as deeply unsettling, not because the Queen's words were harsh, but because they allegedly revealed how much concern she carried in her final years about divisions growing quietly within the family itself. Reports suggest one particularly sensitive section referenced the need to protect the continuity of the crow. N from internal fracture. Language that immediately sparked concern among those present because of ongoing tensions that have shadowed the monarchy since the aftermath of Prince Harry and Meghan's departure from royal duties. While no official confirmation has emerged regarding the exact wording, royal commentators and longtime palace observers now whisper that the Queen may have privately outlined her fears about loyalty, influence, and the dangerous consequences of personal ambition overtaking institutional duty. Catherine reportedly struggled to continue reading at several moments during the meeting, especially as the letter reflected on motherhood, endurance, and the emotional isolation that often comes with protecting the monarchy during periods of internal conflict. According to insiders, William remained silent for much of the discussion, watching carefully as Catherine absorbed words that seemed to redefine not only her future role, but the emotional cost attached to it. Senior palace staff were allegedly instructed to remove all traces of the consultation from official schedules, an unusual move that immediately intensified speculation among royal correspondents already ensaying tension behind closed doors. And as whispers spread quietly through royal circles, some insiders began suggesting that the Queen's final private wishes may have already reshaped William and Catherine's inner circle in ways the public still cannot fully see. Sources close to palace operations claim the emotional aftermath lingered long after the meeting ended, with Catherine quietly stepping back from several private engagements in the days that followed, while senior aides scrambled to contain growing rumors surrounding the mysterious letter. But the real shock wasn't simply that the Queen had written the letter, it was what she allegedly revealed about the future of the monarchy, and the people she no longer trusted to protect it. Long before the public ever heard whispers of the Queen's private letter, there were already rumors inside Buckingham Palace about a sealed collection of documents hidden alongside the late monarch's famous red boxes. Few believed the stories. Fewer still imagined one of those letters would one day leave Catherine visibly devastated. Yet according to palace insiders, that hidden collection was never ordinary correspondence. It was said to contain deeply personal reflections written away from official ministers, away from public announcements, and away from the polished language of royal statements. These were the words of a sovereign who had spent 70 years studying the quiet fractures of her own family, understanding that the greatest threats to the crown rarely arrived with noise. They arrived softly, through ambition, resentment, rivalry, and silence. Reports suggest the letter meant for Catherine was written during the Queen's final months at Balmoral, when the weight of age, duty, and history pressed more heavily than ever. It was there, Insiders claim that the Queen began setting down thoughts not for Parliament, not for historians, but for the people she believed would one day carry the emotional burden of the monarchy forward. And Catherine, by all accounts, was one of them. Palace administrative whispers suggest the document contained reflections on loyalty, sacrifice, and what one source called future storms within the family, a phrase that reportedly sent a chill through those who later reviewed the letter's contents. Historians connected to royal coverage have quietly compared the secrecy around the letter to older Windsor succession protocols, when private warnings were often passed through family hands long before the public understood what was happening. But this letter was different. It was not merely about titles, ceremonies, or appearances. It allegedly reached into the heart of the monarchy's next generation, naming Princess Charlotte's future role with a directness that caught even seasoned aides off guard. William, according to rumors circulating inside palace circles, had known the document existed but delayed placing it before Catherine until he believed she was strong enough to read it without being crushed by the emotional weight. That delay now seems deeply revealing, because it suggests the Prince of Wales understood the letter was not a gentle message of comfort. It was a burden. It was a warning. It was the late Queen's voice reaching forward into a family still fighting old battles under new conditions. Sources familiar with palace operations claim only a handful of senior royals knew the letter had been preserved at all, which explains why its sudden resurfacing created such tension behind closed doors. The Queen's concerns, insiders say, centered on stability during the NGA period of growing internal fractures, when trust had become fragile and every private decision carried public consequences. For Catherine, the discovery was not simply emotional because of what the Queen wrote about her. It was devastating because of what the Queen appeared to foresee. A monarchy where the next generation would need protection not only from outside pressure, but from wounds inside the family itself. But while the palace tried to preserve silence around the document, whispers about one explosive passage had already begun leaking beyond royal walls. According to multiple royal insiders, it was not the beginning of the Queen's letter that broke Catherine emotionally, it was the final paragraph. A passage so personal, so unexpectedly direct, that even seasoned palace aides reportedly lowered their eyes as the princess struggled to finish reading it aloud. Reports suggest the late Queen described Catherine as the steady future of the crown, a phrase that, if accurate, carried far more weight than simple affection. It sounded like recognition. It sounded like duty being passed from one woman to another, not through ceremony, but through quiet suffering. For Catherine, who had spent years enduring pressure, public judgment, family tension, and the impossible burden of silence, those words allegedly struck with devastating force. Insiders whisper that the letter praised her restraint during one of the monarchy's most turbulent modern chapters. When accusations, interviews, memoirs, and private grievances spilled into the public arena while Catherine remained largely composed, that restraint, according to palace sources, was exactly what the Queen had noticed. Not the grand speeches, not the headlines, not the glittering events, but the discipline to stay silent when silence was painful, and the strength to keep serving when the family around her seemed to be breaking into rival camps. The deeper Catherine read, the more personal the message reportedly became. One section allegedly turned toward George, Charlotte, and Louis, warning that the fractures inside the royal family could one day reach the children if the adults failed to protect them from bitterness, entitlement, and division. It was at this point insiders claim that Catherine paused several times, visibly overwhelmed by the idea that the Queen had not only seen the present conflict, but had feared its consequences for the next generation. The mention of Charlotte reportedly carried a special emotional weight, because it suggested the late monarch saw in the young princess a future role, shaped not by glamour, but by responsibility, discipline, and loyalty to the crown. Yet the most unsettling line, according to royal commentators, was the alleged warning about those who seek privilege without duty. The wording has sparked intense speculation, because many believe it may have indirectly reflected the Queen's concerns about the wider tensions involving Harry and Meghan. Especially after years of public criticism, fractured trust, and repeated challenges to the royal institution. No palace source has confirmed the intended target, but the phrase reportedly landed inside the room like a verdict. William, according to those familiar with the meeting, remained beside Catherine throughout the emotional reading, silent but deeply attentive, as if he understood that this was not simply his grandmother comforting his wife from beyond the grave. It was the late sovereign drawing a line between service and self-interest, between sacrifice and spectacle, between the crow. Treat N as a sacred trust, and the crown as something to be used. Palace staff later described the atmosphere as heavier than most crisis briefings, not because anyone shouted, but because everyone seemed to understand that the letter had changed the emotional temperature of the family forever. Catherine's tears were not weakness. They were the response of a woman suddenly confronted with the full meaning of her place in history, and with the terrifying knowledge that the Queen may have left her not only praise, but a burden no one else could carry in quite the same way. But hidden between the emotional words of encouragement was something far more unsettling, a warning about a battle for influence already unfolding behind palace doors. While Catherine struggled to process the emotional weight of the Queen's private words, Prince William reportedly reacted very differently. According to insiders, the future king became unusually quiet after the meeting because the letter appeared to confirm fears he had privately carried for years. Reports suggest William did not see the document as merely sentimental or symbolic. He saw it as evidence, a final signal from Queen Elizabeth II that the monarch, Chai, was entering a dangerous phase, where emotional wounds inside the family could become institutional weaknesses if they were not handled with discipline. For William, the Queen's alleged emphasis on duty before emotion was not a cold instruction. It was a survival code. It meant that personal pain, private loyalty, and family disappointment could never be allowed to outweigh the stability of the crown. Palace insiders claim that almost immediately after the letter resurfaced, conversations shifted away from grief and toward protection, especially protection of George, Charlotte, and Louis, who would one day inherit not only titles, but the consequences of every fracture left unresolved by the adults around them. William, according to sources, understood this with brutal clarity. He had watched public interviews, accusations, memoir revelations, and palace disagreements turn private family matters into international spectacles. Now, with the Queen's warning in front of him, those past conflicts reportedly seemed less like isolated storms and more like symptoms of a deeper problem. Trust had become fragile, and the next generation could not be left exposed to it. Sources whisper that William quietly ordered a review of certain internal royal arrangements after the letter's discovery, not as an act of revenge, but as what senior aides allegedly called a continuity safeguard. That phrase, cold and bureaucratic on the surface, carried enormous meaning behind palace doors. It suggested that access, influence, correspondence, family roles, and private channels may have been reconsidered through one unforgiving question. Does this protect the future of the crown, or does it endanger it? Catherine, still shaken by the emotional force of the Queen's words, is said to have spent hours with William discussing Charlotte's future responsibilities, not in the language of glamour or privilege, but in the language of pressure, discipline, and preparation. The idea that Charlotte might one day become a crucial stabilizing figure inside the royal family reportedly deepened Catherine's sense of duty, while strengthening William's conviction that his wife was no longer simply supporting the institution from beside him or her, was becoming one of its central guardians. Royal commentators now believe that the meeting quietly elevated Catherine's influence within the family even further, because the Queen's alleged trust in her gave moral weight to decisions William had already been moving toward. And shortly afterward, palace staff noticed something significant: increased coordination between William, Catherine, and Princess Anne. It was subtle, it was disciplined, but insiders describe it as unmistakable. Anne, long viewed as the iron spine of the monarchy, reportedly understood the implications of the Queen's letter immediately. If Catherine carried the emotional mandate, and William carried the constitutional future, Anne carried the old guard's unflinching memory of what duty demanded. Together, their quiet alignment suggested a new internal force forming behind palace walls, one built not on popularity, but on preservation. Yet every move toward control creates resistance, and every secret powerful enough to reshape the inner circle becomes dangerous once others begin searching for it. But as William began quietly moving behind the scenes, another alarming problem emerged. Someone outside the inner circle had apparently learned the letter existed. The moment whispers about the Queen's private letter escaped Kensington Palace, panic reportedly spread through the crowd. Rough sections of the royal household. Because even fragments of the document became public, the emotional fallout inside the monarchy could spiral into something far larger than a family disagreement. Palace insiders claim staff were warned not to discuss the meeting under any circumstances. And that warning alone made the situation feel more serious than an ordinary private family matter. It suggested the letter had touched something sensitive, something connected not just to grief, but to succession, influence, and the future balance of power inside the House of Windsor. Reports suggest concerns quickly grew over possible leaks connected to private correspondence archives, especially after royal journalists began hearing whispers about what one commentator called an emotional intervention from beyond the grave. The phrase spread quietly but dangerously, because it captured the fear now moving through palace corridors. Queen Elizabeth II's words had not remained buried. They had returned at the exact moment the family was already strained by public suspicion, private rivalries, and the constant pressure of protecting the next generation. Sources familiar with royal operation. S. allegedly described urgent conversations about safeguarding sensitive documents, tightening archive access, and determining who might have known the letter existed before Catherine read it. No one wanted another royal document becoming a weapon in the press. No one wanted the Queen's private warning reduced to headlines, speculation, or factional gossip. Yet the more the palace tried to contain it, the more powerful the mystery became. Commentators connected the situation to broader tensions surrounding legacy and control, arguing that any private message from the late Queen to Catherine would inevitably carry institutional weight, especially if it referenced George, Charlotte, and Louis. Catherine, according to insiders, became increasingly protective of her children's privacy afterward, not from ordinary public interest, but from the deeper fear that their futures could be pulled into conflicts they were too young to understand. For a mother, that was devastating. For a future queen, it was strategic. William reportedly responded by tightening internal communication channels across key palace offices, ensuring that sensitive discussions moved through fewer hands and that informed, read-out briefings were quietly discouraged. It was not dramatic in the public sense. There were no statements, no denials, no official acknowledgement, but inside the palace, silence itself became the signal. The fewer people spoke, the clearer it became that something important had shifted. Some insiders now believe the Queen intentionally wrote the letter knowing it would guide Catherine during a future crisis, almost as if she understood that one day the Princess of Wales would need more than public approval to survive the emotional weight of royal duty. She would need confirmation. She would need strength. She would need to know that the burden placed on her had been seen long before it arrived, and that possibility made the leak rumors even more dangerous, because if the Queen had truly written with the future in mind, then the letter was not just a memory of the past. It was a map, a warning, a quiet command left behind for the people she trusted most. But the most chilling realization came later, because many inside the palace began to suspect the Queen had predicted this exact moment years before it happened. As the emotional aftermath continued behind palace walls, one truth report repeatedly became impossible for William and Catherine to ignore. The Queen's letter was never simply a private message. According to royal insiders, it was a final blueprint for survival, a warning written by a monarch who understood exactly how fragile the institution could become once loyalty began collapsing from within. Reports suggest the Queen urged Catherine to remain emotionally strong during future royal conflict, not because strength would spare her pain, but because the crown would demand discipline even when the family around her felt divided. The letter allegedly framed the monarchy as a sacred duty held in trust for generations not yet born. And those words reportedly struck Catherine with devastating force. They transformed her role from one of support into one of guardianship. Sources whisper that the Queen believed Catherine would become one of the monarchy's central stabilizing forces, a woman whose quiet endurance could steady the institution when louder voices tried to pull it apart. Palace insiders claim the emotional impact of the letter permanently changed how Catherine viewed her future. She was no longer simply preparing to stand beside William. She was being asked, in the Queen's own alleged language, to protect the soul of the crown itself. William reportedly interpreted the document as both guidance and responsibility, a reminder that leadership inside the royal family would require harder choices than public appearances could ever reveal. And in that realization, Catherine and William's private grief began turning into strategy. Commentators now believe the Queen intentionally positioned Catherine and Princess Anne as protectors of royal continuity. Catherine as the emotional anchor of the next reign, Anne as the iron-willed defender of tradition, both bound by a shared understanding that duty must survive where personal trust has weakened. The resurfacing of the letter has reportedly intensified quiet discussions about the monarchy's long-term future, especially as questions of influence, succession, and loyalty grows sharper behind closed doors. Insiders now describe the document as one of the most emotionally powerful private messages ever linked to the late Queen, not because it revealed scandal, but because it revealed foresight. It suggested that Queen Elizabeth II saw the storm forming long before others dared to name it. She understood that the monarchy's greatest battles would not always come from outside critics, but from emotional fractures inside the family itself. For Catherine, that realization carried both pain and purpose. The tears that first followed the letter were not the end of her strength, they were the beginning of a new burden, one shaped by legacy, motherhood, and the quiet terror of being trusted by history. And as silence once again settled over Kensington Palace, one haunting question remained. What other secrets did the Queen leave behind, waiting for the right moment to change the monarchy forever? Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.